G'day you mob, welcome to this episode of The Goss, where we sit down each week, my dad and I, and we talk about the week's news in Australia and worldwide. So it's getting harder and harder to find good news stories, guys. I tell you what, there is definitely one certain news story that is on the news, that is in the media, that is soaking up all of the headlines, and it is driving most people nuts, I think. They're getting a bit over hearing about the C word, right? The C word. Anyway, today's a really good episode. It ended up being a massively long one. So again, I'm going to divide it into two parts for your benefit, but also for my transcriber's benefit, as I'm sure he doesn't want to sit there for 2 hours and just do one episode. So in the first half, guys, we talk about blind piano tuner Graham McGowan and his job. We talk about how Queensland fishermen are fighting with sharks over their livelihood. So they're trying to catch fish, but sharks are giving them a hard time and they're getting sharked, right? They've turned the word into a verb, sharked. We also talk about a 5-meter albino Burmese python that was found in Queensland this week, and a bit more about introduced species in Australia and the exotic pet trade, and we compare it to the United States of America. And then lastly, we get onto middle-aged women who are turning to bodybuilding. They are becoming bodybuilders. And more broadly, we talk about the fashion scene and bodybuilding and unrealistic expectations with body types and how they may affect children and teenagers. Don't forget, guys, if you want access to the entire episode today, make sure to sign up for the Aussie English Premium Podcast or for the Academy. You can do so at aussieenglish.com.au to get the video, the full MP3, and the transcript. Without any further ado, guys, let's get into today's episode. Smack the kookaburra and let's begin.
On the go.
We're going. So, Dad, excellent. Welcome to this episode of The Goss number 13.
13. Lucky 13. Yahoo.
So that's, 12 weeks worth, I think.
Yeah, because we doubled up for one of them.
Exactly. We might have to do that today. We'll see how we go. But how's your week been? You don't want to talk about it, or you do want to talk about it?
Oh, yeah. Look, it's been okay. We got, I had a field trip for the photography class that I'm running, and then tonight's class has been cancelled.
Yeah.
So the local community centre is basically shutting down. It's only their admin staff who are going to be working, so there's no classes on.
Are we mentioning the reason
the C word,
why, or are we not? Are we trying to avoid that today?
Look, if we can avoid it, but it's the only bloody story in the news. And in fact, even the other stories open with the line, "You're probably sick of hearing about the C word, so we're going to talk about something else." So
it's become the new C word, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's pretty irritating because I'm trying to find news stories and it has just dominated the news.
Completely.
It's like every single thing is COVID, COVID. And, you go onto Reddit where quite often there's really good news stories. And again, fortunately, they've put the tags on there.
Yeah.
So you know what the stories are about.
Hashtag Corona.
Yeah, but Jesus, no one's talking about anything else. So it is difficult.
Yeah. Look, I do have my usual sort of news trawls that I do with a couple of online servers and a couple of newspapers online.
Which ones do you trust?
Which ones do I trust? Well, the ABC News.
Yep.
The Guardian.
Yep.
And then The Age.
Yep.
And then there's a bunch of other things that crop up, and like news.com.au is the most popular, whatever that means, news website, but it's basically a trashy magazine setting themselves up as news because 90% of the stories are clickbait celebrity stories. So,
or the ads for them.
Yeah, and I think they gain their status as the most popular just simply by the fact that they get more clicks through. Because they push things through all the social media. So it pops up on Facebook in particular. It's all over the place. Every time I go into Facebook, the second story will be an ad coming up from news.com. So I try and avoid them. But every one of them, you go to the ABC News website and they go, today's highlights, and the top 6 stories, which they highlight on their website, are all coronavirus yesterday. And I went, really? Oh, sorry, I mentioned the C word. I just sit there and go, oh, look, I want to know. Just give me the bloody summary.
Yeah.
Here's one news story. Here's the summary. This is the latest from the medical advice. This is the latest thing that states in the country are doing. This is the international highlights. I don't need 27 human interest stories about how somebody managed to get off a cruise ship without being tested and now they got coronavirus. I don't care unless they're my next door neighbour. So.
All right, well, let's move straight on. Get over it. So you had a story that you wanted to share about a blind piano tuner named Graham McGowan.
We'll do it up front, but this is one of those ones I've been trying, and I sent it to you under the heading of puppies and kittens stories.
It was kind of sad, so I didn't get the puppies and kittens
But
it
was sad in one sense, but he's retired, and I think it was more the celebration of a life. And a life at work, and I was just thinking about with all of the down news that we've been talking about, and it really dominates the news stories. It'd be useful to do what a lot of television news have done in the past and have that. And I used to joke about calling it the puppies and kittens story, the closer, with the 2-minute human interest, warm and fuzzy feeling.
Well,
and this is the closest I could find.
There's a cliche where I remember, I don't know if it's a film, I don't know if it's like Anchorman or something, but it's one of those films where they have, the news is like murder, death, whatever, and then at the end they're like, and now check out this little chipmunk or squirrel that's riding, behind an electric boat on a thing, just zooming around in the water. I think that's Anchorman, but it is so much like that at times. Yeah. So what's the story about?
Well, this guy, and I can't remember his name now. You'll have it in front.
Graham McGowan.
Graham, hey Graham, if you're listening, a really nice human interest story in a sense that he's been a piano tuner for 50 years and he's blind and he's just retiring from work. And the story is really about him saying that piano tuning is one of those jobs, one of the very few jobs that he was aware of that somebody with a visual disability was actually in a better position to do than somebody with normal sight.
And why is that?
Because they have enhanced hearing. And it doesn't mean that their hearing sensory system is any better, but just their brain is more tuned into hearing because that's their primary sense. Whereas for most people who are sighted, our primary sense, the way we get most of our information from the world, is by sight.
Well, and I think they've shown, haven't they, in studies for people who have lost a sensory perception that there are physiological, biological ramifications where parts of the brain have enlarged to take over.
They load on the other senses.
Yeah, and that's definitely the case with hearing, right? Yeah. There's I've seen a blind guy riding a bike clicking, and he can hear when he's almost using echolocation, I think, effectively, where he can tell when something's getting close to him or not. And it's pretty surreal to think, that's possible.
Yeah. So, the story is really about him saying that he says that he is better than electronic tuning because he has such a fine-tuned ear. And I think I'm not an audiologist, nor am I an audio technician, but I suspect what's happening there is that electronic detection will detect a pure note, but pianos are not pure. And so it would be very difficult for an electronic thing to exactly hit what a pure note sounds like when it's not pure. You hit a middle C on the piano, and it's because it's got the vibration of a steel string. Yeah, it's not going to be that pure note that you would get out of an electronic.
Well, tone, and I would imagine that too. The piano just needs to be tuned relative to itself, right? So you would start with middle C
and then tune every note up and down.
Yeah, and potentially based on the essence of the piano, what wood it's made from, the temperature, whatever it is, you could imagine that middle C note might not necessarily be perfect for the piano itself if you were to just do the very technical, this is the exact frequency. Maybe we tune it sharp or flat and then do the rest of the piano relevant to itself. Because obviously if it's just you playing the piano by itself, it doesn't need to be perfectly in tune with everything else because there's no other instruments playing.
The separation of the notes needs to be correct.
Yeah.
And look, obviously it'll depend on the soundboard on the piano, the backing of it and those sort of things. And if you're playing a grand piano or even a standard piano, whether you've got it open or closed, because I'm sure that will affect how we detect the transmission of sound from the actual chord itself. But that was just an interesting story that he's saying that this is something that is sort of going out of style because anybody can walk in with a tuning instrument now and just go ping ping, providing they understand the mechanics of a piano, and that's not going to take long to teach someone. Then they can do it. Whereas he's saying that his ear and the ear of other people who've done it in the past is better than the electronic version. So that's a really interesting one.
It's tough too. I imagine that it's the sort of law of diminishing returns. You could probably buy a cheap electric tuner
yourself
and do it yourself.
For $100 you can buy something and do it yourself, as opposed to paying whatever you pay for a piano tuner. Ironically, we've got a piano at home that hasn't been tuned.
Imagine having a guitar
years,
having a guitar tuner to come around every time you need it. You'd be
yeah,
like, screw that.
Which, and this is a random aside, but I was watching Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman fooling about on Instagram the other day, where he obviously has cancelled concerts, and instead of that, he's now doing these random studio concerts out of his home studio. I think it's his warehouse, not his home. But and because of the rules of the number of people that you can have in these places and so on, he's got a technician himself and Nicole, who's doing all the running around and rubbish and singing background vocals and stuff. Excuse me. And the technician is actually playing, as Keith said, he said, I'm really playing karaoke, because he's playing guitar and singing, and this guy's just playing all the instrumental tracks for his songs behind it.
Yeah.
So he's singing live to his own recordings without the voice and guitar track on them. And so that was really interesting. But I was watching him, and he was messing about with one, and he was retuning his guitar. And you're a musician, so you'll be able to understand it. I'm not. You were, but where he just strummed an open chord, and then played a chord, strummed a plain chord, and then he picked one string and went tweak and said, right, that's it.
You just get to know it, though.
Yeah, you hear the instrument, and obviously, for me, I can hear when it's off, but I don't know how to fix it.
It'd be the same as you being in your four-wheel drive, driving around, and you hear a rattle or you feel a bump somewhere, and you're like, okay, I know what's wrong instantly. Or a mechanic knowing that, right? They can just hear a sound, a buzz, and they're like instantly.
No, I've got to move the G chord just a tiny little bit sharper.
I think you're controlling the strum, and so you know which chord, which string you've hit at what time.
I know.
Then which one needs to be tuned. But just the fact
that becomes innate is a really interesting thing.
I was watching some stuff recently on acoustic guitar stuff. There's a guy called, I think it's Estas Tornes, and he does like a lot of Spanish acoustic stuff. And you see him giving a concert or something, and he'll tune halfway through a song.
Yeah,
and that's crazy because he can just hear it and then just bang. And
you
just
see
keep
a lot
going,
of musicians doing that in rock and roll and stuff. Although most lead guitarists, certainly lead guitarists who are also singing, like Keith Urban is a good example, Bruce Springsteen, a bunch of others that I've seen, they have 5 or 6 guitars that after every song, or maybe 2 songs, they're handing it over to a technician who's running out the back with it, tuning it and bringing it back out to them.
I think the trouble there too sometimes is that they'll be using different tunings. So you have things like drop D and drop C.
Exactly. So they obviously have specific guitars that are tuned to different keys, but they'll also have presumably different guitars that they know with the pedals in front of them, they can get exactly the sound they want out of one guitar that they can't get out of another one. So,
and it probably gets annoying, once you get to the size of Bruce Springsteen, where you're such a talented player, you'd probably want very specific tone and sound and everything coming out of certain instruments for certain songs, for certain parts, in certain locations. And so you have the skill to be able to be like, I'm not just going to use one guitar for this whole thing, even if it stays in tune, but I want to, actually keep playing with my art and tinkering with it.
And look, I mean, I think there's also things like audience expectation, and Bruce Springsteen's a good example of that. Because whenever he plays Born to Run, he plays it on his old hybrid Telecaster, which is the one that he wrote that song on back in the early 1970s. He recorded it on that, and that's what people expect him to play when he's playing that song. And a bunch of others he'll use it as well. But if he just played his a Stratocaster, people would go, "That's not right. You don't play it on that guitar."
So what do you think stopped you from becoming a musician?
George Benson, I blame him.
Why is that? He was just too good. He's a guitarist,
he's
right?
He's a jazz guitarist and sort of popular jazz guitarist. I first saw him live when I was about 13 or 14, I think. And I'd been messing around with an acoustic guitar. cheap acoustic guitar that a friend of mine gave me because he was sick of playing it, and much to the chagrin of his parents. But so I think I might have given it back eventually. But
I don't think that got handed down to me.
No, it didn't. Yours was my sister's guitar, which was a classical acoustic guitar.
Yep.
And I'd played and I learned a few chords and messed around, and I could play a 3-chord tune and so on. But that was about as far as I went. And then I saw George Benson play and went, this is not human. This is sort of, if that's the level that you want to aspire to, forget it. Take up tennis. So, and I was never that interested and into it anyway.
Yeah.
I suppose if I'd been really into it, I would have looked at George Benson and go, that's who I want to be, and I'm going to practice and practice and practice until I can be as good as I possibly can, which I used to do with sport. And I was perfectly happy to watch Bjorn Borg play tennis and go, I want to be like that one day, knowing full well that I was never going to be. But I want to get better. But music really didn't do that much for me. So, and I could read music in the sense of understand music, but I never got to the point of being able to sight read it in time. Be able to just literally scroll across the music and say. And play it to that. So I would have to learn by ear.
Yeah.
And then I would translate that into the music and go, oh, yeah, that makes sense. And I've got friends who can't read music at all, but they're really good musicians. And there are some very famous... there's some very famous world-class musicians.
Tommy Emmanuel
can't read music.
Yeah.
Bruce Springsteen can read music, but he doesn't write in music. Tommy Emmanuel is the classic one. I don't know if you've heard that story about him when he was a child.
I wonder how many musicians these days, though, write in music. I would imagine that most of them just sit down and play until they write something. And they're not writing notes down on a piece of paper.
And with electronic technology now, you can sit on a piano or a guitar, play it, and software will generate the music for you.
Yeah.
Now you've got to tweak it and things, but it'll generate the basic chord structure or the notes if you're playing individual notes. So
some of that stuff's amazing. Again, coming back to, I guess, disabled people. Beethoven at the end of his life was deaf, right?
Yeah, he went deaf between the 5th and 6th. Well, he was going deaf in the 5th symphony and he was deaf by the time he wrote the 6th.
Yeah, exactly. So he had obviously, like with tuning the guitar with Keith Urban and just knowing the sound and when to do what, he obviously had everything still in his mind, even if he couldn't hear, and could just write down the notes and know what he wants. And so the tragic thing there, but amazing thing, is that he wrote the 6th, and by the time he finished it, he never heard it.
No.
Right.
And arguably, as soon as you use hyperbole, people will turn this into an argument, but arguably the most beautiful piece of music ever written is Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and he never heard it.
Yeah.
He wrote the most beautiful music ever written and never heard it.
Well, he heard it in his head.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, exactly. And
but it's crazy, imagine being a painter who's blind. You couldn't fathom that, but no. I guess,
Yeah, but because painting is a pure aesthetic, whereas music is technical in that you can play music without having to hear it. And so you can write music without having to hear it. So
it's so crazy.
Yeah, but have you heard that Tommy Emmanuel story about when he was a child? And I've heard him tell it, and I'm obviously paraphrasing, and I'll probably get half of it wrong. But when he was about 5 or 6 years old, he went with his mother to visit her sister, his aunt. And he was just dicking around in the lounge room, and they got sick of him. And his aunt just said, "Oh, look, there's a piano out in the next room. Why don't you go and play it?"
Yeah.
And he just went and walked in there and started playing it. And his aunt turned to her sister, his mother, and said, "How long has he been having piano lessons?" And she said, "He's never played the piano before in his life." He just sat down there and played a few notes and just worked out, oh, this is what this is. I can make a tune out of this, and I could play something from memory. And so some people just have that. I've got a friend that I haven't seen for years, but he could pick up an instrument that he'd never played before and just play it. Because
I think you can work out those patterns.
He bought, I remember I was at his place once years ago, and he bought a saxophone. And I said, "You don't play saxophone?" He said, "No, I've never picked one up before." But he picked it up, and within 2 minutes he could play it.
Yeah.
All he had to do was work out which the fingering worked, and because he'd played other wind instruments, the fingering is basically the same. And so and it wasn't that he'd played other instruments in the same family. He'd played a flute, but he just went, "Yeah, I can do this," and he did it.
But you would imagine that'd be the same thing for you, say, with sports. You were a decathlete back in the day, and you had an all-round good ability at different sports. And so once you get to that point, you could probably start any other sport and much more quickly than someone who is completely naive to any sport.
Yes, it's
pick
that
it up.
general
because you just
eye-hand
get it.
coordination.
Yeah.
And for me, and I've always said that most sports are about your feet.
Yeah.
And if you've got good foot coordination and you can work out what the footwork is, and if you can do that innately, which you tend to do if you play a lot of sport. If you play basketball and tennis, you'd look at them and go, this is completely different. They're completely different sports, but they're all about footwork.
Yeah. It's all positioning your body in the right place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So the next story I had here was that Queensland fishermen want to relax shark fishing rules to stop predators taking their catch. Have you heard about that recently?
Yeah, it's a bit weird, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting because, my first reaction is like, fuck these guys, the sharks got decimated, their numbers completely decimated for years and years and years, thanks movie Jaws. And then, they're starting to make their way back. Same as the crocodile, right? Didn't they get down to a few tens of thousands?
Yeah, estuarine crocodiles in Australia.
Almost went extinct.
Yeah, almost went extinct. And now they're overpopulated, according to most people who live in northern Australia. So.
But the story here was that Queensland fishermen are saying that sharks are now taking 70% of their catch. And they want the state government to do something. And there was one trawler who has to now tie steel chains to the back of his net that he's dragging through the ocean because they don't like the noise of the chains banging together. But he'll have up to 30 sharks just following the boat.
Yeah.
Anytime he's, trawling to try and catch it, up to 9 feet long. And if they destroy the net, he loses his whole catch, but then he has to spend all the time fixing the net.
Thousands of dollars of work to
he was saying
nets.
He's losing $1,000 a night. Potentially. So sharks are also causing trouble for recreational fishermen's significant amount of fish that are being caught by recreational fishermen. They're getting sharked. I liked how they'd made a verb.
We turn a noun into a verb, like Google.
So it's when you've cast your line out, something bites, and you start, fighting to get it in, and just as you get it in,
takes it.
It
becomes the
head.
super bait.
Yeah, exactly. The head comes up, and that's it. So you've been sharked. But they were saying they're losing between, up to 58 out of 60 fish. They reel in and there's just part of them missing. So they're wanting the government to reconsider laws so that they can hunt sharks of 1.5 meters. And they want to be able to harvest sharks in proportion to fish, which is where the article then got me, because it's kind of like, okay, we're protecting the apex predator, but we're taking all their food. And so their numbers are potentially, outgrowing the resource that they're living off. So should we be harvesting apex predators at the same rate or in proportion to the other animals that we're harvesting in a food chain or in an ecosystem?
Yeah, look, it's really hard when we start messing with it to the point where the numbers start to count, where we're messing with one part of the food chain without adjusting the others.
Yeah.
But, if there's one side of that argument, I think, that just says, look, if we're messing with it so much, why not keep messing with it?
Yeah.
And the other side that sits there and says, well, should we be taking that much? But then we've been harvesting, people have been harvesting fish from the ocean for tens of thousands of years.
Yeah.
And the fact is that our population keeps increasing, and this is only going to get worse. So we have to have a way of balancing it. And I think if we're looking at ways of having economically and ecologically sustainable fisheries in combination, then that's the way to do it. And if that means we do have to cull sharks, then so be it. Because then the choice is, if people are going to ramp up and say, well, we shouldn't be culling sharks, and I can understand their argument in isolation, then the alternative is, well, the fishing industry dies.
Yeah.
Do you want to eat fish? Then we have to cull sharks. And people will simply say, well, don't eat fish. What else are you going to eat? We'll eat vegetables.
Well, and it's got to be
how are we going to grow the vegetables?
Yeah. You can clear land, kill the animals that are there.
Yeah.
I find it ironic, too, that shark are fish, but we don't seem to give a shit about killing tuna or mackerel or whatever other fish. But when it's a shark, everyone's like, God, no, leave it alone.
Yeah, apex predators.
Why do you think we favour things like apex predators like that and don't consider them equally with other animals that we're farming or hunting?
Yeah. Oh, look, I mean, I think it's that, in this case, one of the terms I'll use is obviously irrelevant, but it's the big and furry.
Yeah.
We like lions and tigers and so on. But,
unless they're chasing us.
Unless they're chasing us. But even so, people are just going to look at that and go, why'd we go out killing lions and tigers?
But if you were to go out shooting deer or kangaroos.
And Yeah. So I think there's an element of that. Obviously, sharks aren't furry, but I think it is that big sort of apex predator thing that has some mystique around it.
Why do you think we find them so awe-inspiring?
Because they can kill you.
Yeah, is that the main thing? Do you think,
and they're big.
But do you think this has been around the whole time, where tens of thousands of years ago we were still in awe of such creatures compared to, say, wild sheep or wild rats or whatever? Because it always seems to be that with Indigenous stories and culture, it's always these large, conspicuous animals that have the mystery and stories and magic, revolving around them. So do you think it is that they're just...
I think it is, yeah, and we've invented stories.
G'day, mate. That was the first half of this episode of The Goss. If you would like to continue watching or continue listening to this episode, make sure that you sign up for the premium podcast or Academy memberships at aussieenglish.com.au, where you will get full access to these entire episodes of this series and much, much more. You can go check that out using the links below, or just go to aussieenglish.com.au. Once again, thank you so much for joining me, mate, and I will see you next time. Peace.